All right, welcome back to another podcast of More Than a Rabbi. I am your host, El Garza. Today we're going to be discussing, more of a continuing discussion of the language of the New Testament, the language of Yeshua Jesus and his disciples, because I still get a number of questions and comments about the New Testament as a whole. Was it completely originally written in Greek? Was some of it written in another language like Hebrew or Aramaic? Or was it all written in another language like Hebrew and then translated into Greek? And these are good questions. And it's not that we are dismissing anybody's belief as far as if they believe that the New Testament was originally written in Greek, which some do, or some believe that's half and half, or some Hebrew and some percentage of the Greek, or all possibly in Hebrew. It doesn't dismiss the New Testament as being God's preserved word, whether it's in the language of Hebrew, the original, Greek, or if you want to believe the original, or in its Latin form, German form, English form. For some scholars, it's considered the preserved. That God preserved the words of Yeshua Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, in all these languages to what we have today. Just like we have the Hebrew Scriptures, which is not a copy, but it is, I'm sorry, it's not a translation, but it is a copy of the original language spoken, and therefore we have that preserved by the Jews, even down to from the 9th to 10th century Masoretic texts, the Leningrad Codex, the Lippo Codexes, and so forth, that we see this translation, we see these copies not of a translation, but based on the original language preserved going back to the prophets of old. So we got to understand that, for some people, it's important to hold a New Testament Greek original authoritative text because it helps them to look at it as if this is the original language and the copies from the hand of the disciples themselves. And if it wasn't, then we can for some reason they believe we can dismiss the New Testament, which is not the case. Even if it wasn't written originally in Greek but translated, it is still a preserved copy and a preserved translation from the copy of the original language of the Hebrew or Aramaic or whatever language they want to argue about. But what's interesting is, what does the evidence show? I'm more interested in the research and the evidence. Now, if you look at the one side of the scholarship, of course, in the West, from the Europe down to even here in the West in America, of course, most scholars hold to the original language of the Greek as if Jesus and his apostles were Hellenistic Jews. And what's interesting is that is not what the evidence shows from what we know from Hebrew scholars in Israel today, doing all the research like Emmanuel Tov and others. They will tell you the evidence does not point to that. In fact, if you read the work of Emmanuel Tov and others, we know that there are no, and we don't have any, this is a fact, we don't have Greek New Testaments found anywhere in the Judean desert, Israel, Jerusalem, none. The Greek New Testament texts, the earliest ones that were discovered, of course, and found, go more towards Alexandria, Egypt, and Cairo, and those areas where, of course, there were Hellenistic Jews, Greek-speaking Jews, and so forth. So we know without a doubt, with the fact that within Israel, Jerusalem, the surrounding the Judean desert, there are no Greek New Testament texts found. That's a fact. We have Hebrew texts of the Old Testament, which is called the Proto-Masoretic text, found fragments of them in the Judean desert, within the Judean desert, and within Israel, knowing that at the temple and the local synagogues in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, the Jews read from the Hebrew scriptures. In fact, that is what we know as evidence from what we know from the findings. There is nothing else. There is no Septuagint. Septuagint's most coming out from more up on the Qumran community up there, where Jews had more of a diverse look at scripture, where they used many different texts, Sumerian Pentateuch as well, and others. But within Israel, Jerusalem itself, and the surrounding, and within the local synagogues and the temple, it was the Proto-Masoretic text. It was the Hebrew text that was being used and read by Yeshua Jesus and his apostles. They did not consult or use the Septuagint. In fact, even Jerome makes that point, that Matthew, who wrote in Hebrew, did not use or look to the Septuagint at all. So it's not a surprise because Yeshua himself spoke Hebrew. He spoke to Paul in Hebrew. He spoke to his disciples in Hebrew as a rabbi. All his parables were in Hebrew. So we know without a doubt this is the case. Now, what we do know, and here's a quote from another scholar, a Hebrew scholar, who says the New Testament presents Jesus as knowledgeable of both written and spoken Hebrew. He is portrayed reading and teaching from the Bible, and there are clear indications in these accounts that he used the Hebrew scriptures. In this, he was not alone. We have not a single example of a Jewish teacher of the first century in the land of Israel teaching from any other version of the scriptures than Hebrew. So, and then he goes on to say, to even make the point stronger, in addition, Jesus is often described speaking in parables. These were delivered orally in popular, non-scholarly settings. They were also in Hebrew. Outside of the Gospels, story parables of the type associated with Jesus are to be found only in rabbinic literature, and without exception, they are all in Hebrew. We have not a single parable in Aramaic, so it seems that according to Jewish customs, one did not tell parables in Aramaic. To suggest that Jesus told his parables in Aramaic is to ignore overwhelming evidence to the contrary. So again, this is not news. As the gospel spread outside, going to Alexandria, to the more of the Greek-speaking Jews, the Hellenistic Jews, of course they were being written in the Greek and copied in the Greek, but the sources themselves is to ignore the fact that Yeshua Jesus, being a rabbi and a Jew, and his apostles being Jews, they did not use the Septuagint, which some people I've heard scholars say. Well, I've heard scholars make the point. Well, Jesus or the apostles quoted the Septuagint more often than anything, and Jesus quoted this. That's nonsense. The Septuagint was not in use in the land of Israel and the surrounding areas of the Judean desert and Jerusalem. It was the Proto-Masoretic text, Hebrew text, that they used and read from. And this is clear from even the scholars in the land of Israel today, the Hebrew scholars who are doing the research as we speak, experts in the language, and they are looking at the evidence of the texts that are found, the fragments that are found in those areas. So to make the assumption that Jesus and his apostles were Hellenistic Jews, that they wrote in Greek, would be contrary to all the evidence being shown and what has been discovered and what we know today. Now, that doesn't mean that God didn't preserve his word or the words of Yeshua Jesus himself and the apostles and the writings and so forth. They're preserved in not only in Greek, but we also have the Latin, we have the German, we go down to the Coptic and all the different versions, and even to the English today. So we have enough to piece back together what Yeshua Jesus said, spoke, and taught to his disciples, even if he did it in Hebrew. And there are Hebrew copies and texts that we can look at, but nobody wants to acknowledge them, of certain Gospels, like Matthew, and Luke, and John, and we have some Revelation, and Jude, and James in Hebrew. We can look at and study, but nobody wants to give them any kind of credence or any kind of second look, which is a shame, because we know the language of the Messiah, we know the language of the apostles, and yet nobody wants to look and see what was really said. And instead they want to go to a secondary source language like Greek or Latin or another language. So yes, if you are a specific type of Christian believer, then yes, you might hold to a specific text like the Greek as being the original, which again, there's no evidence of that at all. There are no Greek New Testaments found anywhere in the Judean desert of Israel, land of Israel, surrounding areas. Zero. All the earliest texts come from, as you would expect, Alexandria in Egypt, Cairo, and all those others, area where the Hellenistic Greek Jews were and lived as Greeks, as the Greek custom, but as Jews, Greek-speaking Jews, referred to as Hellenists. And we see this even in the New Testament, where they talk about the Hellenistic Jews in Acts, the Greek-speaking Jews as well, and even the Pharisees were worried that Jesus was going to go to the Dispersia, those Jews who were scattered, and to the Hellenists, the Greek-speaking Jews, and teach them that he was going to go that direction, because that wasn't their culture. They were Jews, Hebrew-speaking Jews. So again, this is not any kind of heresy or anything like that, because You can believe in the New Testament as being God's preserved words in the languages that He preserved them in. He can do what He wants. He gave us the Hebrew Scriptures, which we have today in Hebrew, and He gave us the New Testament in multiple languages to the nations that we have in Greek, Latin, and German, and other languages in English, and we can still see what the message is. Even without the New Testament per se, which they didn't have in the first century, or for the first 400 years, there was no real New Testament. The Hebrew Scriptures was enough to point back to the Messiah and who He was and what He did. In fact, that's what Yeshua Jesus did. He opened up the Scriptures, the Hebrew Bible of the day, and taught His disciples everything concerning Himself from the Scriptures, from the Torah and the Psalms and the prophets. This is what He did. He didn't give them something new that wasn't already written about Himself from the Hebrew Scriptures. So everything about the Messiah Himself can be found in the Hebrew Scriptures. The New Testament is just another another level above the foundation of the Hebrew Scriptures. The foundation for the New Testament is the Hebrew Scriptures, and we cannot ignore that. So it's very important that we see that when we study about Yeshua being more than a rabbi. We look at the language He spoke from, how He quoted the Hebrew Scriptures, not the Septuagint. The apostles used the Hebrew Scriptures they read from at the local synagogues. When Yeshua stood there in the synagogues in His hometown or in the surrounding areas or at the temple itself, He read from the Hebrew Scriptures. That is what all the evidence shows. And again, you can see this again in Emmanuel Tov's work. You can see it in pretty much any work. In fact, he makes this point in a number of areas. He's written a number of articles on this in his books and his teachings. He's considered one of the leading experts in this field regarding textual criticism of the Hebrew Scriptures and on the Septuagint itself. So he's done the work. And but again, everyone wants to ignore the evidence because they want to hold on to a specific original copy belief. It doesn't have to be that way. And it's nothing that we can say, well, if you reject the Greek New Testament as the original, you're not a believer. That is nonsense, or you're not a Christian. So you want to put someone's salvation in a copy of a text? When Paul even talks about this, and I believe it's in 2 Corinthians 3, where he says that it's that is which is written on stone or on we call paper in the translation of papyri on stone. That is not where the authority comes from. He makes it clear that we are the living letter, the walking and living letter. It is not what is written on stone, which would have been looked at as the commandments of God, or on what is written on paper or a letter from us. He says, but you are the living letter. Living as an example. And again, we have to understand this, that even Paul's language was Hebrew. So we got to consider this, and I wanted to follow up with this on one of my other podcasts because I still get some questions on it and some concerns on, is this heresy to deny, or does this mean you're not a believer to deny the New Testament original Greek? My salvation is not based on what I believe my salvation is not based on if it was written in Greek or even Hebrew or any other language. My salvation, it comes from Yeshua Jesus Himself and who He is and what He did for me in the redemptive plan of His sacrifice once for all for sins, and my faith and trust in Him. I look to the Hebrew Scriptures and to His teachings, as even Paul talks about. What the Hebrew Scriptures were for teaching and for correcting and rebuking and to grow into the good works that we're supposed to get into. They're supposed to train us, the Scriptures are. So they're not for, Paul didn't say the Scriptures are for salvation. They're for us to correct, rebuke, train, all those things for righteousness, lead us on the path. That's what they're for. So they're not, it's not, the Scriptures are for our salvation. Yeshua is our salvation. And the Scriptures teach us concerning Him and help us to teach others and correct others and rebuke others and to bring others up into righteousness. So that's what they're for. So we look at the Scriptures with that authority. So we got to consider this. We can't put the Father, Son, and Holy Scriptures up there and think that that's our salvation, and if we don't hold to a specific view, then we're not saved. That is not the case. And I challenge anybody, look at the evidence, consider the evidence, and it's irrefutable when you have the scholars in Israel talking about it, giving the evidence, the findings we have, the scrolls found in the Judea, the Proto-Masoretic text being used, the Hebrew Scriptures, no Greek New Testament ever found in the land of Israel, anywhere in those areas. The Septuagint either, by that stream, the Septuagint is really found outside of it in the Qumran and other communities where Jews use many different authoritative texts besides that, but the Proto-Masoretic text we know was the most preserved, perfect text that we could find that was used, and we can compare those texts to what we have now with the Leningrad and even with the Aleppo and see the 98% agreeability between them. So this is nothing new. So I hope this helps us get a little ahead of the game with understanding Yeshua as more than a rabbi who read from the Hebrew Scriptures, who his disciples spoke and taught others as well in Hebrew, and probably wrote the Gospels in Hebrew originally, being translated into other languages, and even Paul himself writing in his own language, as Jerome talks about, and then, of course, the other epistles. So this is nothing new. It's not a heresy or a denial of the New Testament. It's, in fact, lifting up the New Testament in the original language of the Messiah, Yeshua Jesus, as in the language he spoke, Hebrew, and the apostles themselves. I want to go back to what he spoke in the original language if I can. I want to know what he said in the language he spoke, not in translation. Specifically non-Semitic translations like the Greek, Latin, other ones that's more Western-oriented, where things get obscurely lost a lot of times in translation. So if you have any other questions, we're going to continue on the podcast next time, looking deeper into the messianic expectations within Judaism and ancient Judaism at the time of Yeshua Jesus and before, and look at more deeply the Hebrew Scriptures as was spoken of by Yeshua himself concerning himself, and how the apostles knew this and quoted from it and pointing to the Messiah as Yeshua himself being the Messiah. So if you have any other questions, you go to my website, drlgarza.org. You can leave me questions, comments here. I'll be continuing my podcast shortly, hopefully another week or so, as I'm continuing writing my book. I will deliver my message out there to you guys. And again, if you have any questions, please email me any thoughts or concerns. But I want to say thank you again, and stay tuned for another podcast of More Than a Rabbi.